All right. Hey there, everybody. It's been a minute since I've been live, so I'm really excited about our conversation today and what we're going to be talking about because I think it's really timely. And so before I jump into our live discussion, I'm just trying to make sure I am actually streaming because sometimes StreamYard. Yeah, I think I'm good. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed. But before I jump into the discussion for today, I want to go ahead and introduce myself for those of you who may not be familiar with me and my content. I am Dr. MJ. Mary McConnor is my government name, but I go by MJ. And I am the founder and CEO of Inclusive Excellence Consulting, which is a full service consultancy headquartered in Memphis, but we work with clients across the nation and now officially globally. Well, I shouldn't say officially. We've been working with an international client for a little while now. But yeah, I love working in the DEI space. I've done this for a long time. And, what I like to do is have some live discussions every once in a while about some of the different things that we are seeing in the industry and what we're seeing in the workforce. So I'm going to go ahead and jump straight in because, I like to be conscious of time. And y'all also know that I have a tendency to get off track. So I'm going to pull up my notes because I know me and you all know me well enough to know that sometimes I'll just kind of go down a rabbit hole, especially because of how much is happening around DEI right now. And especially over the last few years, we've seen this shift happen where everybody was gun ho about, okay, we gotta implement DEI, bring in a chief diversity officer, and then we've seen more and more organizations who are like, well, maybe we shouldn't, or what do we do, right? And so that's kind of what I want to focus on today, and specifically leadership's response to DEI. So, if you haven't had a chance to read the study by Chief that was recently done, I highly encourage you to click the link in the comments section of the LinkedIn post where I posted this live, because you'll be able to actually click on the link and see the article. But what their study found is that an overwhelming number of organizations and organizational leaders are still very much in support of DEI and still implement DEI initiatives within their organizations. However, executives are finding it difficult to be vocal about their advocacy, and they're finding it difficult to speak out about being in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I find it to be, really interesting. And I tried to look at it from multiple lenses. And I am going to talk about why I think there are some leaders who are hesitant to talk about DEI. But I also think that we live in a time where it's really important for us to think about who we are as an organization, who we are trying to attract, who we are trying to appeal to, right? When we think about our services and we think about what our organizations are designed to do, right? And so I think I get some of the hesitation, right? But I also think it's equally important for leaders to think about what impact will their silence have, right? Will it have a long-term impact if you don't stand firm in what you all believe in as an organization? So let's jump into it. The obvious, right? Why we see some leaders hesitate to be vocal about their advocacy and vocal about certain social issues and vocal about supporting DEI is because of our current political climate, right? We have talked quite a bit about the political climate, and I've talked quite a bit about it in presentations. You all know me, I am not afraid to jump right into some of those heavier, more difficult conversations, because I think before we can really have a productive discussion, we have to know what are some of the reasons for this hesitation. Is there something happening right now in our society that is causing folks to question whether or not DEI is effective, whether or not it works? And obviously there are some things. And so for a lot of people in leadership positions, they tend to want to avoid certain things out of fear of alienating customers and employees with differing viewpoints. A big part of it boils down to that. And so we have to acknowledge that not very many leaders come from social justice or equity and inclusion or anti-racism backgrounds, right? A lot of CEOs and people in senior leadership positions may have never had to navigate that before. And so there is this fear of, if we have these conversations, will it be polarizing? Will we have more conflict internally than what we need to have, right? And so there's this viewpoint of that it can turn into something that can be very polarizing within the organization. And also, too, I want to say this because I come from the academy. I used to work in higher education for years. And one thing we have to recognize, too, is that oftentimes for leaders in senior leadership positions is that it's not just employees and maybe the people they work with, like customers or students, who are wanting to have those conversations or not wanting to have those conversations around DEI. There are a lot of stakeholders who have a lot of input. So you have to think about your board. You have the board of directors or board of trustees. You have maybe alumni or people who are supporting the organization externally. You have, legislatures. You have so many different things you have to think of. So when you think of that and you think about all of the different stakeholders who have input or who have say in how they think an organization should be led or ran, of course, there are going to be some leaders who naturally say, you know what, let's just avoid this. Let's not talk about it because I don't want to alienate anyone because of all the different viewpoints that are out there. So that is one of the reasons why some leaders are hesitant. I think another reason too, and I thought about this quite a bit, I do think there's still a lack of clarity on what effective DEI leadership should look like. I often say this is that, the beauty of DEI is that there's so many different ways it can be implemented. But at the same time, that can be difficult for some people who don't necessarily operate well in that gray area. For some people, they like it like, hey, what do I need to do? What's the best practice? How do we, implement this, right? And with DEI, there is no one size fits approach no one size fits all approach, right? Oh, excuse me, got froggy. So that's what makes it particularly difficult for some leaders because they're like, okay, we're hearing one school of thought over here, and then we're hearing another DEI practitioner maybe explain this way to do it. And then we're hearing like certain social justice groups saying that we need to do this, right? And so there's so many different ways that things can be implemented. And, that lack of clarity can lead to uncertainty about how do we put this into action, right? And so I think that's another reason why we're seeing some hesitation on the part of some leaders because of that lack of clarity. Another big one is, and this is quite common, and I've seen this throughout my career, is that there is this fear of making mistakes, right? And there's this apprehension about saying something wrong or doing the wrong thing that could potentially damage the organization's reputation or even the leader's reputation, right? And so we do have to acknowledge that sometimes navigating certain social justice issues and how to address it can be difficult to talk about it. And especially with the way our culture has been, I would say the last 6 to 7 years with cancel culture, right? As a DEI practitioner, I personally do not like cancel culture. I loathe cancel culture. And that is a different topic for a different day. But I think sometimes when we're quick to cancel people, we don't create that space where they have the opportunity to learn, right? And so some behaviors and certain things can be unlearned, right? But we have to create space for that. We can't be so quick to say, you know what, cancel, you're done, right? And there are certain situations where some folks should be canceled. Like if it's that egregious, it's like, you know what, yeah, we don't need you representing our company. However, there are other times where I think people may say something and may not have worded it in the best way, or they've done something where maybe they didn't really understand the impact of their actions, right? Their intent was not to cause harm. But if we don't create that space for them to make a mistake, or if we don't create the space at least at least address it after and say, hey, in the future, consider this as opposed to this, then people are going to be very apprehensive. There are going to be a lot of leaders who are going to be apprehensive about um, voicing their views or their organization's views around certain social issues or around DEI. And then I think one of the last ones, and I've thought about this a little bit too, is sometimes leaders experience a lack of support too. Now, having been in a leadership position, having seen other leaders navigate this, the higher up you get sometimes, the lonelier it can get. And that is very true. And I know we've heard that reference before, a lot of us, but it's very true because sometimes, a lot of people expect leaders to have all the answers. And the reality is, a lot of CEOs and organizational leaders don't have all the answers. They don't. And with that, because they're oftentimes in a position where they're trying to make sure they're looking out for everybody else within the organization. But nobody is necessarily saying, hey, how can we best support you in your leadership role? Right. And so that's something to consider too, as we think about individuals in senior leadership positions or in, board positions, whatever it may be. They may feel isolated as well in their advocacy efforts because they don't know how to navigate it because they may not necessarily have the support they need. So as we think about that, because I talked about a lot, right? We talked about the political climate playing a role. We talked about sometimes there's a lack of clarity on what DEI leadership should look like. We also talked about, for a lot of leaders, there's this fear of making mistakes. And so with that comes a lot of apprehension because they don't want to say the wrong thing or damage the organization's reputation. And then lastly, for some leaders, there is a lack of support, right? If they do take a stance, who's going to have their back, right? Will the board have their back? Will, outside stakeholders have their back? Will the community have their back? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns with it. So here's some things I think that are really important as we think about how to overcome these barriers. And this is specifically for individuals who are either in leadership positions or folks who work with individuals in leadership positions, right? If you are, let's say, a DEI practitioner or you're a researcher or a scholar and you do a lot of work as it relates to social issues, you are in a position where you can help lead up, right? You can help advise. And so these are some of the things I think is really important for leaders to understand. That first one is going to always be essential, whether it relates to DEI or some other area, right? Is that leading by example is always going to be highly effective. And so if we encourage leaders to showcase their personal commitment through their actions and everyday decisions, right? And if we highlight the impact of that and the impact that it can have on an organization, we know that that can be really impactful, right? Because, and I know some people are going to say, oh, don't do it. Don't talk about the business case, but I have to, right? Because we have to look at it from multiple angles. We're talking about an enterprise. I can't only talk about the human case for DEI and not talk about the business case as well. I talk about both, right? And so when you lead by example, and you encourage folks to highlight, or I'm sorry, you encourage folks to show a personal commitment through their actions and everyday decisions, and you provide guidance on how to do so, then you're more likely going to have a culture where DEI is not only supported, but the people within that organization are going to feel like it's sincere. Like it's not just performative. It is something that the organization is actually committed to. And we know that when organizations are authentic in their DEI efforts, it often leads to improved performance, improved innovation, better talent acquisition, you name it. It improves so many different areas within that organization. So we have to think about how we encourage leaders to lead by example and the impact that it has on the organization and the impact it has in terms of the human case and the business case, right? Another big one, and I wrote this one down, but thinking about how we can help leaders develop inclusive communication strategies, right? How we can help them develop the skills to navigate those conversations. As I mentioned before, a lot of times we assume that people in leadership positions should automatically know how to do certain things. Oh, you're a leader. You should automatically know how to have these kind of conversations. You should automatically know how to navigate social justice issues. You should know how to respond to this particular situation. When we know that's not necessarily the case. If you look at any person in a leadership position, they have certain strengths. What those strengths are varies. Some leaders are really good with, more behind the scenes, different day to day operations, overseeing the day to day operations, where some are really good at being the face of the organization. They're extroverted, they're outgoing. Some are really good at, problem solving, some finance, some, they all come from different backgrounds. So what that looks like is going to be different. Not every leader has a background in navigating difficult conversations around social issues or navigating conversations around equity, inclusion, and access. So, what can we do to help make sure that leaders foster those techniques? And even if we're not the ones necessarily teaching individuals how to develop those skills, what can we do to help provide them with the resources and support to seek out those skills? To say, you know what? Hey, one of the things that I think would be highly beneficial is if we can learn how to navigate these conversations, and because of where you are in your leadership role, you would be the perfect person to lead by example. So maybe what we can do is have an outside organization come in and show us how to navigate these kind of conversations. Because I'm going to tell you all this, like in terms of effective communication and inclusive communication, that is always going to be the backbone of a lot of what we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of what we do when it comes to addressing social issues. Communication is key, and how we communicate it is equally important, right? And it goes back to that point I made about how there are a lot of leaders who might be hesitant to talk about social issues because they're scared to make mistakes. They're scared they're going to say the wrong thing, or they're scared they're going to damage the organization's reputation because of something they said. But if we're creating a space where we're teaching folks or encouraging folks to have inclusive communication, to use inclusive language, then that solves that issue, right? It at least addresses that particular issue around not saying the wrong thing, right? We can all learn how to be more inclusive in our language. I've been working in DEI for years, and I'm still learning every day. Every day. There is not a day that goes by where I'm not learning something new, or I'm not unlearning something, right? Like a term that might have been okay and acceptable 10 years ago, maybe we don't say that anymore. So language is constantly evolving. And with that, communication needs to evolve as well. I think another one, and this has gotten more and more attention, I would say, over the last 3 to 4 years in particular, is this concept of psychological safety. And as we think about how leaders can have these conversations and how leaders can learn how to navigate social issues and have productive conversations, we have to make sure that leaders also understand the importance of psychological safety within the workplace, right? And the importance of psychological safety, not just for their employees, but think about it from a broader scale, right? Think about it in terms of, if we do have these conversations within our organization, are we creating that space where these conversations can be productive and people can voice their concerns without fear of judgment, without fear of retaliation? Because the thing about it is, when you think about the political climate, especially, we've seen that some organizations have reacted by, unfortunately terminating some folks. And in some cases, maybe it was justified, but, before we jump to termination and disciplinary actions, Are we creating an environment where we can actually have these productive conversations? And if so, what does that look like? Does there need to be an outside facilitator to come in and help navigate and lead these conversations so that people feel safe enough to actually talk about some of these things that are impacting them? I will tell you on now, I interact with a lot of different members of the workforce. I interact with a lot of Gen Zers. I talk about Gen Z a lot because, that they seem to be a hot topic right now, talking about multi generational diversity. And I'll tell you, a lot of them want to have spaces where they have these conversations. They want to be able to work for organizations where they feel like their personal values align, where they feel like the social issues that they're in support of, aligns with what the organization is doing and championing. So we have to think about that. And for people who are like, well, we just got to do DEI quietly, I can tell you now, there are certain people who are not going to be quiet. They don't want quiet. They want to know, where do you stand? Where do we stand on this particular matter? These issues aren't going to be quiet. What we're seeing in our nation is loud in terms of some of the different social issues that are coming up, some of the things happening on a global scale. It is loud, and we have to be prepared to respond. We cannot retreat and say, oh, okay, we're just going to do this, do these little initiatives in silence, because what we're experiencing as a society, there is nothing silent about it. Right. And so as we think about that, as we think about how we have these conversations, it's important for us to also think about psychological safety at every step of how we plan this out, how you map out, how are we going to have this conversation? How are we going to champion certain things in the workplace? And then lastly, I think this is important, especially for folks who serve in board roles or who serve maybe as an advisor of some sort. But we have to make sure that we are providing leaders with tools and resources to be effective DEI advocates. I cannot stress this enough. I have seen so many folks put a certain amount of, expectations on a leader. And sometimes we don't always think about what tools and resources do they need in order to be effective at advocating for DEI or for certain social issues, right? Is there an opportunity for mentorship and collaboration there? Can we help lead up? And for the folks on boards and who serve in advisory capacities, particularly, I'm especially speaking to you all, because sometimes, and I've seen it, I serve on a lot of boards, and I'm not calling out any board members or anything like that, but sometimes we show up to meetings, okay, everything sounds great, you all keep up the great work, and we're out of there, right? And we're off to our next meeting, because many of us who serve on boards, usually we're we're pretty involved, and we serve in a lot of different capacities, right? We're busy folks, so it's easy for us to just be like, all right, y'all good, okay, cool, we out of here, see you later, without really thinking about, hey, how are we supporting you? Are we supporting you in a way where you feel like you have what you need to be effective in your role? Are we supporting you in a way where you feel like that if you do take a stance, or if the organization does take this position, that we would have your back? That is a conversation that needs to be had, because a lot of leaders will say this, and I've heard this time and time again, like, yeah, I don't know if my board always has my back. And that's a problem. That is a problem if a person in an executive leadership role feels like that their board might leave them hanging in a moment where they typically need your support the most. I can think of some really great examples of organizations that, when the organization and that chief executive officer took a position, or they took a certain stance, that their board was on it, they jumped right in like, yep, and we are in full support of this, right? And it makes a world of a difference, not only for the people within the organization to know that folks outside of the organization or board members have their full support, but it also helps that leader to know like, okay, if I do take this stance, if I do advocate for certain things within our workplace, I know that I'm not in this alone. It is essential, especially my fellow board members out there. I hope you're listening. We have to make sure that we are creating that culture, or we're helping to foster a culture where when leaders feel that it is best to take a particular stance, that we are supporting them. And if we do have some hesitation, voice that. But still, we have to be present. We cannot show up to meetings and say, all right, cool, all right, everybody's good. See you later. Right. And just checking a box. Like it needs to be proactive support, mentorship, and collaboration. So here's my call to action for folks listening to this. I want us to think about I want us to think about leadership and think about all of the different things that comes with it. And I want us to actually think about how we can best support leaders, no matter what position we're in, whether we're a direct report or we serve in a board capacity, we're maybe an alumni of a organization, or maybe we're a donor. But think about how we actually show up for those leaders, and think about what can we do to help foster courageous leadership. What can we do to help support individuals who do want to take a stance but may not know where to begin? What can we do to help make sure that organizations are having healthy dialogue around social issues? Because like I said, we can try to do DEI in silence, but the issues that we see in the workplace are not silent. The individuals who work within our organizations oftentimes want to know where we stand on certain matters. So there are times where you cannot be silent. And we have to think about that as we navigate the current, political climate and all the things, all the different changes happening at the legislative level, at the with the Supreme Court. I'm looking at EEOC. They're dropping new stuff every day. I'm like, okay, all right, it is a lot happening. How are we preparing ourselves? How are we making sure that our leaders understand the importance of what this work entails? So that is my live for today. I did a great job. I stayed under 30 minutes, y'all. As you know, I'm pretty passionate about this area, so I have to stay on track. But I feel good about this conversation today. And I hope it did spark a little interest of thinking about, okay, what can I do? What can I do to make sure that whatever organization I'm working with, or if I'm working with a certain leader, or if I have engagement with this leader, that I'm best supporting them as well. So I will try to do another LinkedIn Live in a couple of weeks because I do enjoy this a lot. And if you found this insightful, feel free to repost it on LinkedIn, or if you're on YouTube, you can share the YouTube link because I believe I'm streaming it to both. Hey, Dr. Sharice, I just want to say, hey there, good to see you. But yeah, make sure you share it, and we will continue to have these conversations because I can tell you DEI is not going anywhere despite what some media outlets have been portraying. I'm telling you, it's here to stay. The way our society continues to evolve, we're becoming more and more diverse. There are a lot of diverse needs. There's no escaping it, right? All right, you all. Well, I hope you all have a great Wednesday afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you at the next LinkedIn Live discussion.